The dust cloud appeared first, stretching across the horizon like a brown scar against the amber sky of late afternoon. Samuel Hartwell squinted from his porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching what should have been a single wagon carrying his mail-order bride transform into something that made his blood run ice cold. The sound reached him next, not the gentle clatter of wagon wheels he'd been expecting for 3 months, but the thunder of hundreds of hooves pounding the prairie earth in perfect rhythm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel had been alone on the Broken Arrow Ranch for 7 years, ever since his father died and left him 2,000 acres of stubborn Montana soil and memories that cut deeper than winter wind. At 34, he'd grown tired of talking to horses and eating beans from a can while watching other men in town walk home to warm kitchens and children's laughter. The loneliness had become a physical thing, settling in his chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. So he'd done what desperate men do. He'd written to the matrimonial agency in Chicago, describing himself honestly as a rancher of modest means, seeking a woman of strong character for companionship and partnership in building a life on the frontier. He'd enclosed his photograph and a lock of his dark hair, as requested, along with the $30 fee that represented nearly 2 months of careful saving. Rebecca Morrison was supposed to arrive today. Her letters had been proper and polite, describing herself as a 26-year-old seamstress from Ohio, with no family and a desire for a fresh start in the West. She'd written about her love of gardening and her skill with mending, about her hope to raise children and keep a Christian home. Samuel had read those letters so many times the paper had worn soft as cloth, and he'd spent the morning cleaning his house until it gleamed, picking wildflowers for the kitchen table, and rehearsing what he might say when he first saw her face. Instead, he was staring at an approaching wall of painted warriors on horseback, their war cries now audible across the distance, their weapons glinting in the dying sunlight. Samuel set down his coffee cup with hands that barely trembled. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford, and walked inside to retrieve his Winchester rifle from above the fireplace mantel. The Lakota war party crested the hill behind his property like a wave breaking over stone. Samuel counted them as they spread across his pasture, easily 150 mounted warriors, their horses stepping high and proud, eagle feathers streaming from their hair, faces painted with symbols he couldn't read but understood meant death for anyone who stood in their way. At their head rode a man whose presence commanded attention even at a distance, his broad shoulders draped in a buffalo hide decorated with intricate beadwork, his black hair braided with silver ornaments. That caught the light. Samuel had heard the stories, of course. Every rancher within 100 miles had heard about the troubles brewing since the government broke the last treaty and ordered all native tribes onto reservations by spring. The cavalry had been making sweeps through the territory, rounding up families and forcing them onto lands that couldn't support a prairie dog, much less proud nations that had roamed these plains for generations. Some chiefs had submitted peacefully. Others, like the one now approaching Samuel's ranch, had chosen a different path. The war party stopped at the edge of Samuel's fence line, their horses snorting and pawing the ground while their riders sat motionless as carved stone. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the evening wind rustling through the cottonwood trees Samuel's father had planted along the creek. Samuel walked slowly down his porch steps, rifle held loose in his hands but not aimed, a careful balance between readiness and respect that might mean the difference between living to see another sunrise or becoming buzzard food before midnight. The chief urged his horse forward, a magnificent spotted stallion that stepped with the fluid grace of water flowing over rocks. As he drew closer, Samuel could see the intelligence burning in the man's dark eyes, the careful way he studied every detail of the ranch buildings, the respect with which his warriors waited for his signal. This was no random raid by young hotheads looking for glory. This was something else entirely. "You are the one they call Hartwell," the chief said in English, carried only the slightest accent, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded slowly. "I am. This is my land, your land." The chief's mouth curved in what might have been a smile if there had been any warmth in it. "Your papers say so. Your government says so. But the earth remembers different owners." "I've never taken what wasn't mine," Samuel replied carefully. "My father bought this section fair and legal from the territorial office. We've run cattle. Here, nothing more." The chief studied him for a long moment, his gaze taking in Samuel's worn boots, his patched shirt, the rifle held with obvious familiarity but not pointed in threat. "You have not raised your weapon. You haven't given me a reason to." This time the chief did smile, though it held more winter than warmth. "I am called Crying Wolf. These are my warriors. We have been riding for 4 days, and our horses need water. Your creek runs clean." Samuel felt sweat beating between his shoulder blades despite the cool evening air. 150 warriors could destroy everything he'd built in less time than it took to brew coffee, and they all knew it. But something in the chief's manner suggested this wasn't about destruction, at least not yet. "The creek belongs to no man," Samuel said finally. "Your horses are welcome to drink." Crying Wolf raised his hand, and immediately the war party began moving toward the water with a discipline that spoke of years fighting together. They rode in perfect formation, never turning their backs on Samuel, weapons ready but not actively threatening. Samuel watched them water their horses and fill their own vessels, noting how they took only what they needed and left the stream running clear. "For the next traveler, you are not afraid," Crying Wolf observed, dismounting and walking his stallion to the creek's edge. "Fear doesn't change what's happening," Samuel replied. "Being scared just makes a man stupid when he needs to be smart." The chief's eyes glinted with something that might have been approval. "Your government has given us until the next full moon to report to the Pine Ridge Agency. That is 7 days from now." Samuel waited, sensing there was more coming. 7 days to abandon the graves of our fathers, the hunting grounds where our children learned to ride, the sacred places where our people have prayed for more generations than your government has existed. Crying Wolf's voice remained level, but Samuel could hear the iron beneath the calm. 7 days to become beggars on land that will not feed us, supervised by men who see us as problems to be managed rather than human beings with souls. "That's a hard choice," Samuel said quietly. "It is no choice at all." Crying Wolf turned to face him fully. "We will not go." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal fire. Samuel understood now why 150 warriors had appeared at his ranch instead of the gentle bride he'd been expecting. This wasn't a raid or a random encounter. This was a last stand beginning, and somehow his small corner of Montana had become part of something much larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. "The cavalry will come for you," Samuel said. It wasn't a threat, just a fact spoken by a man who'd lived on the frontier long enough to understand how these things ended. "Yes," Crying Wolf agreed. "They will come with their rifles and their cannons and their certainty that might makes right. They will expect to find us hiding in the hills like animals, or perhaps running toward Canada like rabbits before wolves." Samuel shifted the rifle in his hands, beginning to understand why this conversation was happening on his land, with his permission. "But you're not planning to run." "We are planning to make a stand worthy of our ancestors," Crying Wolf said simply. "A place where the ground is good for horses, where there is water and clear lines of sight, where brave men can die with honor if death is what the spirits have chosen for us." The implication settled on Samuel's shoulders like a lead blanket. His ranch sat on a natural rise overlooking miles of open prairie, with the creek providing fresh water and the hills behind offering defensive positions. It was exactly the kind of ground a military man would choose for a defensive battle, or exactly the kind of place the cavalry would have to cross to reach the warriors making their stand. "You're asking me to choose sides," Samuel said. "I am telling you what is coming," Crying Wolf replied. "Whether you choose a side or not, the storm will reach this place. Your bride will not be arriving on schedule." Samuel felt a bitter laugh escape his throat before he could stop it. After months of preparation, of imagining a new life with a partner who could help him build something lasting on this hard land, he was instead facing the prospect of his ranch becoming a battlefield. The irony was sharp enough to cut. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. Crying Wolf glanced at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue. "The moon will be full in 7 days. The cavalry will likely arrive in 5, expecting to find us easily and drive us back to the reservation before the deadline. We will be here waiting for them. And if I say no, if I tell you to water your horses and ride on, then we water our horses and ride on," Crying Wolf said simply. "But the cavalry will still come, because scouts have already seen our trail. Your ranch will still become part of this war, whether you choose it or not. The only question is whether you face what's coming with allies or alone." Samuel looked out over his land. The pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully, the barn his father had built with his own hands, the house where he'd hoped to raise children with the woman who should have arrived today. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of building, hung in the balance of a decision he'd never expected to make. "I need time to think," he said finally. Crying Wolf nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "We will camp by the creek tonight. In the morning, if you decide we are not welcome, we will move on. If you decide otherwise—" He paused, studying Samuel's face in the gathering darkness. "If you decide otherwise, then you should know what you are choosing. This will not be a small fight. When it is over, nothing will be the same." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The chief turned and walked back toward his warriors, who had finished watering their horses and were setting up a temporary camp with the efficiency of men who had lived their entire lives on the move. Samuel watched them work, noting how they posted sentries, how they tended their horses, how they moved with the quiet confidence of professional soldiers, preparing for battle. As full darkness settled over the ranch, Samuel sat on his porch and tried to imagine Rebecca Morrison arriving tomorrow to find a war party camped in her new backyard. He tried to picture explaining to her that instead of the quiet domestic life they'd planned, she'd be caught in the middle of what might be the last free Indian war on the northern plains. But Rebecca Morrison wasn't coming tomorrow, and perhaps that was for the best. What was coming instead would test every principle Samuel had ever held about right and wrong, about loyalty and survival, about what a man owed to his neighbors and what he owed to his own conscience. The warriors' fires twinkled along the creek like fallen stars, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the rising moon. Samuel cleaned his rifle methodically, checking the action and counting his ammunition, while around him the night filled with the soft sounds of horses, cropping grass and men speaking in low voices in a language older than any boundary line. Drawn on government maps. Tomorrow, he would have to choose not just sides in a coming war, but what kind of man he wanted to be when everything he'd built was put to the test. Tonight, he sat alone with that choice and the knowledge that whatever he decided, there would be no going back to the simple life he'd planned with a mail-order bride and dreams of peaceful prosperity. The unexpected arrival of 150 warriors had changed everything. And Samuel Hartwell was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important moments in a man's life come disguised as disasters, wearing war paint and carrying weapons, demanding answers to questions he'd never thought to ask himself. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Broken Arrow Ranch, with frost painting the grass silver and mist rising from the creek where the Lakota warriors had made their camp. Samuel had slept little, spending most of the night walking the perimeter of his property, checking on his cattle, and wrestling with a decision that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The warriors were already moving when he emerged. From his house, their morning routines carried out with military precision. They tended their horses first, checking hooves and adjusting saddles, then gathered around small fires for a breakfast of dried meat and what looked like ground corn mixed with berries. Samuel noticed they used only dead wood for their fires, and scattered the ashes carefully when finished, leaving barely a trace of their presence. Crying Wolf stood apart from the others, facing east toward the rising sun with his arms raised in what Samuel recognized as morning prayers. The chief's voice carried across the water, speaking words in Lakota that rolled like distant thunder, and his warriors paused in their activities to listen respectfully. When the prayer ended, Crying Wolf walked toward Samuel's house, his expression unreadable in the early morning light. "You have decided," the chief said as he approached the porch. Again, it wasn't a question. Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he'd been keeping warm on the stove and handed one to Crying Wolf. The gesture surprised the chief, who accepted the cup with a slight nod of acknowledgement. "I've been thinking about my father," Samuel said, settling into one of the wooden chairs he'd carved during the long winter evenings. "He came west in 1847, right after the war with Mexico ended. Bought this land from a territorial agent who'd never set foot in Montana, who sold it based on survey marks made by men who spent maybe 3 days riding through here." Crying Wolf sipped the coffee and waited for Samuel to continue. "My father was a good man, but he never questioned whether that paper gave him the right to be here. Never asked who might have been living on this land before the government decided to sell it." Samuel stared into his cup, watching the steam rise in the cold air. "I used to find arrowheads when I was plowing the south field, stone tools near the creek. My father said they were probably old, from Indians who'd moved on long ago." "Your father was not a bad man," Crying Wolf said quietly, "but ignorance can cause as much harm as malice." Samuel looked up, meeting the chief's steady gaze. "Last night I realized something. I've been living my whole life on land that was never really mine to inherit. Legal papers don't change that truth." The admission hung between them like smoke from their coffee cups. Samuel had spent the night walking through memories of his childhood, remembering the reverence with which his father spoke of the land, but also the casual way he'd dismissed any suggestion that others might have prior claims. It was easier to believe the government's version, that this was empty wilderness waiting for the right kind of people to make it productive. "But that's not the whole story," Samuel continued, "because I also realized that leaving now wouldn't change anything for your people. The cavalry is coming whether I'm here or not. Your war is going to happen whether I participate or not. The only question is whether I face what's coming as a man who stands by his principles, or one who runs when things get difficult." Crying Wolf set down his coffee cup and studied Samuel with new interest. "And what are your principles, Samuel Hartwell?" "That a man should defend what's right, even when it's not convenient. That people shouldn't be forced from their homes by men who've never tried to understand them. That sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." Samuel stood up, decision crystallizing with each word. "Your people can stay. Use whatever you need. Fight your war for my land if that's what it takes." The chief was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Samuel's face for any sign of doubt or hidden motive. Finally he nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of a formal treaty. "You understand what you are choosing," Crying Wolf said. "When the soldiers come, you will be seen as a traitor to your own people. If we lose, you will likely die. With us, if we win, you will be hunted by your government for the rest of your life." "Maybe," Samuel agreed. but I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror either way." Crying Wolf stood and extended his hand in the white man's fashion. Samuel shook it, feeling the calluses that spoke of years holding weapons and reins, the strength that came from a lifetime of physical hardship, and something else, a sense of partnership being forged in shared purpose. "There is something else you should know," the chief said. "We are not the only ones who refused the reservation. 3 other bands are traveling this ways, Mulbear's Cheyenne from the Powder River country, a group of Arapaho led by a war chief called Iron Hawk, and some of my own people who chose to follow my war leader, Thunder Horse, instead of coming with me directly." Samuel felt his stomach tighten. How many total? Perhaps 400 warriors plus women and children who refused to be separated from their men. Maybe 600 people altogether. Crying Wolf's expression remained neutral, but Samuel could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes. "They will arrive over the next 3 days. All of them are counting on this place as a gathering point before we make our final stand." 600 people. Samuel tried to imagine that many human beings camping on his ranch, tried to picture the logistics of feeding them, the challenge of keeping order among warriors from different tribes who might have old grievances with each other. His 2,000 acres suddenly seemed very small. "The government won't send a few cavalry troops for something this big," Samuel said. "No, they will send an army." Crying Wolf gazed toward the eastern horizon, where dust clouds might appear at any moment. "General Marcus Whitfield commands the military district that includes this territory. He has perhaps 800 soldiers at Fort Abraham Lincoln, plus artillery and Gatling guns. He will bring everything he has." Samuel had heard of Whitfield, a Civil War veteran who'd made his reputation fighting Confederate cavalry in Virginia, then transferred west to deal with what the newspapers called the Indian problem. He was known for his tactical skill and his absolute belief that Native Americans needed to be completely subjugated for the safety of white settlers. Men like Whitfield didn't negotiate. They imposed solutions through overwhelming force. 800 soldiers against 400 warriors, Samuel mused. On open ground, with artillery support, that's not much of a fight. It would not be if we planned to fight on open ground. Crying Wolf smiled grimly. But we know this country better than any army commander who learned warfare in the forests of Virginia. There are places in these hills where cavalry cannot charge, where cannons cannot be positioned effectively, where a small number of determined fighters can hold off a much larger force. Samuel began to understand the strategy. The warriors weren't planning a traditional Plains Indian raid, striking fast and disappearing before organized resistance could form. They were planning to make Whitfield come to them, to draw the army into terrain that favored defenders over attackers, to make the cost of victory so high that the government might be willing to negotiate rather than accept the casualties. "You're gambling that politicians in Washington will blink if enough soldiers die," Samuel said. "We are gambling that some fights are worth having even if you cannot win them," Crying Wolf corrected. "Our children will remember that their fathers stood up when it mattered, that we did not go quietly into the darkness your government has prepared for us." The chief's words carried an echo of something Samuel had heard his own father say during the dark days after his mother's death, when grief threatened to crush what remained of their family. Sometimes a man has to keep fighting, not because he thinks he can win, but because giving up would mean losing something more important than his life. "What do you need from me?" Samuel asked. "First, we need to move your cattle to the far pastures, away from where the fighting will happen. Some of my warriors are skilled with horses and cattle. They can help with that." Crying Wolf gestured toward the creek bottom. "Second, we need to know every trail, every draw, every defensive position within 10 miles of here. You know this country better than any map." Samuel nodded, already planning the cattle drive that would move his herd to the northern sections. Of his property, away from the likely battlefield. What else? We need you to go to town, Crying Wolf said quietly. Today, act as if nothing has changed. Buy supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food that will keep. Let people see you behaving normally. When the army comes, they will ask questions about what you saw when you saw it. The longer we can delay their understanding of our true numbers and positions, the better our chances become. The request made sense strategically, but Samuel felt his chest tighten at the thought of riding into Millbrook and lying to people he'd known for years. Hardware store owner Jim Brennan had sold him the lumber for his barn repairs. Doc Peterson had set his broken arm 3 winters ago when a spooked horse threw him into a fence post. These weren't strangers, they were neighbors who trusted him, who would expect him to warn them if danger was approaching. They'll ask direct questions, Samuel said. If I lie to them and people die because of it, people are going to die. Regardless, Crying Wolf replied bluntly. The question is how many, and whether their deaths serve any purpose beyond satisfying your government's need to demonstrate its power over those who resist. The chief's words stung because they forced Samuel to confront the full implications of his choice. He wasn't just offering sanctuary to warriors making a last stand. He was actively participating in a deception that might cost the lives of soldiers who were simply following orders, and potentially civilians who happened to be in the wrong place when the fighting started. This is the hardest part, Crying Wolf continued, his voice gentler now. Choosing a side means accepting responsibility for the consequences of that choice, even the consequences you cannot foresee or control. But not choosing is also a choice, and it carries its own burden of responsibility. Samuel thought about Rebecca Morrison, probably sitting in a train somewhere between Chicago and Montana, unaware that the life she'd planned with a rancher she'd never met was about to be replaced by something none of them could have imagined. He thought about the young cavalry troopers who would ride out from Fort Abraham Lincoln, believing they were protecting civilization from savage raiders, not knowing they were walking into an ambush designed by warriors fighting for their very survival. But he also thought about the children in Crying Wolf's band, and the children in the other groups heading toward his ranch, and what their lives would be like on a reservation designed more as a prison than a home. He thought about the casual certainty with which government officials drew lines on maps and declared that entire people should disappear from lands they'd occupied for centuries. I'll go to town, Samuel said finally. I'll buy what you need, and keep my mouth shut about what I've seen. But I won't lie if someone asks me a direct question about people being in danger. Crying Wolf considered this for a moment, then nodded. That is fair. A man must live with his choices, and living with them is easier if they do not require him to betray everything he believes about himself. They spent the next hour planning Samuel's trip to Millbrook, deciding what supplies would be most useful, and how to acquire them without raising suspicion. Ammunition was the trickiest item. Samuel typically bought only enough cartridges for hunting, and the occasional predator threatening his cattle. Suddenly purchasing large quantities of rifle rounds would certainly be noticed and remembered. Buy different calibers, Crying Wolf suggested. Tell people you are planning to do some trading with other ranchers, exchanging cattle for goods. Many warriors carry weapons taken from soldiers or traded from other tribes. We can use whatever ammunition you can obtain. Samuel made a mental list. .45 to 70 cartridges for military rifles, .44 to 40 for Winchester repeaters, 50 to 90 for the Big Sharps buffalo guns some warriors carried. Medical supplies would be easier to explain. Every ranch needed bandages, carbolic acid, and laudanum for treating injured livestock and the inevitable cuts and bruises that came with frontier life. As they talked, Samuel became aware of increased activity in the warrior camp. Scouts were returning from patrols, reporting in the rapid musical syllables of Lakota to warriors who listened intently, and then dispersed to relay information to others. Horses were being saddled and weapons checked with the methodical care of professional soldiers preparing for operations. "What's happening?" Samuel asked. Crying Wolf listened to a report from a young warrior who approached them at a respectful distance, speaking quietly but urgently. The chief's expression remained neutral, but Samuel saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Cavalry patrol," Crying Wolf said. 20 soldiers riding north along the river road. They are still 10 miles away, but they are moving in this direction. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. Routine patrol, or looking for something specific? Unknown. But their presence means we must accelerate our timeline. The chief stood, instantly transforming from a man having a conversation into a military commander issuing orders. "You leave for town now, before they get close enough to see you." "My." Warriors will move deeper into the hills with the horses. If the patrol comes here, they will find an empty ranch and a rancher who went to town for supplies. The plan made sense, but Samuel realized he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once he rode into Millbrook and began purchasing supplies for warriors planning to fight the U.S. Army, he would be guilty of treason by any legal definition. If the authorities discovered his involvement, he would face a court-martial and almost certain execution. But as he saddled his horse and prepared to ride toward town, Samuel found himself thinking not about the risks he was taking, but about the alternative. He could still change his mind, still warn the approaching patrol about the warriors camped on his land, still choose the safety of conformity over the danger of principle. Instead, he mounted his horse and rode toward Millbrook, carrying a list of supplies that would help 400 warriors make their last stand against an army sent to destroy everything they had left to fight for. Behind him, Crying Wolf's men melted into the hills like shadows, leaving barely a trace of their presence, except for the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. The weight of decision settled on Samuel's shoulders like a pack he would carry for the rest of his life, however long that might be. He had chosen his side, and now he would live or die with the consequences of that choice. The town of Millbrook sat in a shallow valley like a handful of wooden blocks scattered by a child, its single main street running parallel to Willow Creek and connecting the dozen businesses that served ranchers and farmers, scattered across 50 square miles of Montana territory. Samuel had ridden this same trail hundreds of times over the years, but today every familiar landmark seemed charged with significance. The lightning-split cottonwood where he'd carved his initials as a boy, the ford where the Miller family had lost their youngest son to flash flooding 3 springs ago, the ridge where Comanche raiders had been spotted in his father's time. The morning sun climbed higher as Samuel approached the outskirts of town, painting the weathered storefronts and dusty streets in harsh golden light that made everything look exposed and vulnerable. He could see people moving about their daily business, Mrs. Patterson hanging laundry behind the boarding house, old Pete Sullivan sweeping the front steps of his saloon, a freight wagon loading supplies at Morrison's General Store. Normal people, living normal lives, unaware that 400 warriors were gathering in the hills less than a day's ride away. Samuel's first stop was the bank, a brick building that served as Millbrook's most substantial structure and the unofficial center of local gossip. He needed to withdraw enough money to purchase the supplies on Crying Wolf's list without raising questions about his sudden spending. And banker Thomas Ashford was exactly the kind of man who noticed unusual financial activity. Ashford looked up from his ledger as Samuel entered, his wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the morning light streaming through the front windows. "Samuel, good to see you. Heard tell you your bride was supposed to arrive yesterday. How did that work out?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow, reminding him of the life he'd been planning just 24 hours ago. Rebecca Morrison should have been unpacking her trunk in his house right now, maybe helping him plan improvements to the kitchen, or discussing where to plant a vegetable garden. Instead, He was preparing to lie to one of the few men in town who'd shown him genuine friendship over the years. She missed her connection in Denver, Samuel said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Telegram said she'd be there another week at least. Ashford's face showed genuine sympathy. That's a shame, son. I know you were looking forward to starting a family. These things have a way of working out, though maybe the delay is for the best. Samuel almost laughed at the irony. If Rebecca had arrived as scheduled, she would have walked into the middle of preparations for an Indian war. The delay that seemed like a disappointment yesterday now felt like divine intervention. I need to withdraw $100, Samuel said, changing the subject before his expression could betray too much. Planning to do some trading with neighboring ranches' cattle for supplies and such. Ashford made a note in his ledger and counted out the money without comment. $100 represented significant wealth in a town where most people saw maybe $50 in cash during an entire year. But Samuel's ranch was known to be modestly prosperous, and trading livestock for goods was common practice among isolated ranchers. You might want to talk to Jim Brennan about ammunition, Ashford suggested as he handed over the bills. He got a big shipment last week. Apparently there's been some trouble with wolves over in Judith Basin country, and folks are stocking up. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. If other people were already buying ammunition in large quantities, his own purchases would attract less attention. I'll stop by his place next. Thanks for the tip. Morrison's General Store occupied the corner building where Main Street intersected with the road leading north toward the railroad depot. The store served as the town's unofficial communication center, where news traveled faster than telegraph wires and speculation grew like weeds after rain. Eleanor Morrison presided over this empire of gossip with the authority of someone who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing it. Samuel Hartwell, Mrs. Morrison exclaimed as he entered, her voice carrying across the store like a church bell. I heard your young lady was delayed. What a disappointment that must be. Word traveled fast in small towns, and Samuel realized that Ashford had probably mentioned Rebecca's delayed arrival to someone within minutes of Samuel leaving the bank. By evening, everyone in Millbrook would know about the missed connection, and would be speculating about what it meant for Samuel's matrimonial prospects. These things happen, Samuel replied, forcing a casual tone. Gives me more time to get the house ready. He began gathering items from his mental list: coffee, flour, bacon, dried beans, salt pork, tinned goods that would keep without refrigeration. Mrs. Morrison watched his selections with obvious curiosity, especially when he added bandages, carbolic acid, and other medical supplies to his pile. Planning to do some doctoring? She asked with the kind of forced lightness that indicated serious interest in the answer. You know how it is on a ranch, Samuel said. Always something getting cut or stepped on. Better to have supplies on hand than ride 20 miles to dock Peterson every time a cow kicks somebody. Mrs. Morrison nodded, but Samuel could see her filing away the information for future conversation. In a town where entertainment was scarce, analyzing neighbors' purchasing patterns provided endless material for speculation and discussion. Samuel's next stop was Brennan's Hardware, where the proprietor was arranging a display of new tools in his front window. Jim Brennan had arrived in Millbrook 5 years earlier, with enough money to buy the struggling hardware business and enough sense to treat his customers fairly. He'd quickly become one of the town's most respected citizens, partly because he minded his own business and partly because he extended credit to struggling ranchers during hard seasons. Morning, Samuel, Brennan called out as Samuel approached the ammunition counter. Tom Ashford mentioned you might be stopping by. The ammunition display was more extensive than Samuel had expected. Boxes of cartridges for every type of rifle commonly used in the territory, from small-caliber varmint guns to the massive buffalo rifles favored by professional hunters. Samuel began selecting boxes according to Crying Wolf specifications, trying to appear casual while his heart hammered against his ribs. 0.45 to 70, 0.44 to 40, 0.50 to 90, Brennan noted as he tallied Samuel's selections. Planning to do some serious hunting? Trading mostly, Samuel replied. Got some neighbors who need ammunition more than they need cattle. Seemed like a good deal for both sides. Brennan nodded without comment, but Samuel noticed in glancing at the quantities being purchased. 200 rounds of mixed ammunition was enough for a small war, and they both knew it. For a moment, Samuel wondered if the hardware store owner suspected something, but Brennan simply wrapped the cartridge boxes in brown paper and added them to Samuel's growing pile of purchases. The final stop was Doc Peterson's office, located above the barber shop in a cramped space that smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey. Peterson had been Nobrooke's only doctor for 15 years, treating everything from bullet wounds to difficult births with the kind of practical skill that came from necessity rather than formal training. He'd also become something of a father figure to Samuel after his own father died, offering advice and companionship during the lonely years of building the ranch. "Samuel, good to see you," Peterson said, looking up from a medical journal he'd been reading. "Heard your bride got delayed. That must be frustrating." Samuel was beginning to understand how quickly news traveled in a small town and how impossible it would be to keep secrets once the fighting started. "Just gives me more time to prepare," he said. "Actually, I was hoping to buy some medical supplies from you laudanum. Morphine if you have it, surgical needles and thread." Peterson's expression shifted slightly, the casual friendliness replaced by professional interest. "Planning to do some serious doctoring out there?" "Hope not," Samuel said honestly. "But you never know what might happen during roundup season. Rather have supplies I don't need than need supplies I don't have." The doctor studied Samuel's face with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for examining patients. "You?" "No, Samuel. If something serious was happening in the area, Indian trouble, maybe, or problems with outlaws, you'd tell folks, wouldn't you? People have a right to know if they're in danger." The direct question hit Samuel like a punch to the stomach. Here was the moment Crying Wolf had warned him about. The choice between maintaining his deception and betraying the trust of a man who'd been like family to him. Samuel met Peterson's eyes and saw genuine concern there. Not just curiosity, but real worry about potential threats to the community. "Doc," Samuel said carefully, "if I knew about specific danger to specific people, I'd speak up. But sometimes a man just gets a feeling that he should be prepared for trouble, you know." Peterson continued studying his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've learned to trust those feelings," he said quietly. "They've kept me alive through more close calls than I care to remember." The doctor gathered the requested medical supplies and packed them in a leather satchel. "No charge for these," he said. "Call it an investment in community preparedness." Samuel felt a stab of guilt at Peterson's generosity, knowing the supplies would be used to treat wounded warriors rather than injured ranch hands. But he also recognized the deeper truth in the doctor's words. Community preparedness meant being ready to help anyone who needed medical attention, regardless of which side they fought on. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, weighted down by the supplies Samuel carried and the deceptions he'd practiced. He'd successfully gathered everything on Crying Wolf's list without raising overt suspicion, but he'd also crossed several moral lines that would be impossible to uncross. He'd lied to friends, manipulated people who trusted him, and actively participated in preparations for violence that might claim the lives of men he'd known since childhood. The sun reached its zenith as Samuel crested the ridge overlooking his property, and what he saw below made him rein in his horse sharply. The ranch that had been empty when he left that morning now showed signs of massive activity. Horse herds grazed in his pastures, far more horses than Crying Wolf's original band had brought with them. Smoke rose from cooking fires scattered throughout the creek bottom. People moved among the cottonwood trees like ants around a disturbed hill dot, As Samuel rode closer, he could see that the other bands Crying Wolf had mentioned were arriving ahead of schedule. Teepees were being erected in orderly rows. Children played in the creek shallows, and women worked at tasks that suggested they planned to stay for more than just a brief rest. This wasn't a war party passing through, this was a community preparing to make a stand. Crying Wolf emerged from a group of men who appeared to be holding a war council, his face grave as he approached Samuel's horse. "The cavalry patrol turned back without reaching your land," he reported, "but our scouts brought other news. General Whitfield is mobilizing his entire command. They will march from Fort Abraham Lincoln tomorrow morning with artillery and supply wagons. We have perhaps 3 days before they arrive." Samuel dismounted and began unloading the supplies he'd purchased, his mind racing to process this new information. 3 days to prepare defensive positions, organize 400 warriors from different tribes who might not speak the same language or share the same tactical traditions, and somehow turn his ranch into a fortress capable of withstanding assault by professional soldiers armed with modern weapons. "How many people are here now?" Samuel asked, gesturing toward the expanding encampment. "Nearly 500, Crying Wolf replied. "More arriving every few hours." Small Bear Cheyenne came in just after noon, and Iron Hawks Arapaho are expected before sunset. Many brought their families. They refused to be separated, even knowing the danger. Samuel looked out over his property and tried to imagine it as the site of a battle that would determine the fate of the last free Native Americans on the northern plains. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether Rebecca Morrison would like the wildflower bouquet he'd planned to give her. Now he was watching children play in the same creek where their fathers might die, trying to preserve a way of life that was already disappearing. "There's something else," Crying Wolf said quietly. "Word of our gathering has reached other ears. A rider came in an hour ago with news from the Crow Reservation. Some of their young men want to join us despite their leader's agreement to serve as Army Scouts." The implications were staggering. If Crow warriors abandoned their posts as government scouts to join the resistance, it would represent a complete breakdown of the careful alliances the Army had built with some tribes to help control others. It would also mean that General Whitfield would be operating without his usual intelligence advantage, blind to Native American movements and intentions. "Are they coming?" Samuel asked. "Unknown. But if they do, we could have 600 warriors instead of 400. Crying Wolf paused, studying Samuel's expression. 600 men willing to die rather than live as prisoners on land that cannot support them. Samuel shouldered the medical supplies and began walking toward the house, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was unfolding on his ranch. He'd agreed to help Crying Wolf's band make a stand, but that decision was expanding beyond anything he could have imagined. His property was becoming the focal point for what might be the largest Native American military action since Little Bighorn. And he was no longer just offering sanctuary. He was actively participating in a rebellion against the United States government. As evening approached and more groups continued arriving, Samuel stood on his porch watching families set up temporary homes in places where he'd planned to graze cattle. Warriors who should have been enemies worked together preparing defensive positions. Children who might be orphans within days played games that would help them remember this time as something other than tragedy. The weight of decision had become the weight of history, and Samuel Hartwell was beginning to understand that some choices transform not just the person making them, but everyone whose lives they touch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moral complexities, and new tests of courage that none of them could fully prepare for. But tonight, under stars that had witnessed countless generations of conflict and change, Samuel knew he had chosen correctly. Whatever came next, he would face it as a man who had stood up when it mattered, who had chosen justice over convenience, who had risked everything for principles that couldn't be purchased with gold or enforced with guns. The deception was complete. The preparations were accelerating, and the final confrontation was only days away. The second dawn after Samuel's trip to Millbrook broke over a transformed landscape. What had been his quiet ranch was now a sprawling encampment that stretched from the creek bottom to the foothills, organized with military precision, despite housing numbers of 4 different tribes who had spent generations as both allies and enemies. The sight that greeted Samuel as he stepped onto his porch would have been impossible to imagine just a week earlier. Hundreds of people working together, with the focused intensity of those who knew their time was running short. Iron Hawks Arapaho had arrived during the night, their approach so silent that Samuel hadn't heard them, despite sleeping fitfully with one ear tuned for trouble. The war chief himself was a man of perhaps 40 years, lean and scarred from a lifetime of warfare, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the defensive preparations already underway. He'd brought 63 warriors and their families, along with a herd of horses that spoke of successful raids against cavalry units foolish enough to venture too far from their forts. Small Bear's Cheyenne contingent had established their section of the camp with the methodical efficiency Samuel associated with professional soldiers. Their leader was older than the others, a weathered veteran of the great buffalo hunts who'd seen his people's traditional way of life destroyed by systematic slaughter of the herds that had sustained them for countless generations. His warriors carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Thunder Horse, Crying Wolf's war leader, commanded perhaps the most dangerous group young Lakota warriors who'd been raised on stories of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who'd grown to manhood watching their elders forced onto reservations while white settlers claimed the hunting grounds their grandfathers had died defending. They moved with the restless energy of barely controlled violence, eager for the chance to strike back against an enemy they saw as responsible for every injustice their people had suffered. The most surprising arrivals had come just before midnight. A delegation of 17 Crow warriors led by a young man called Running Elk, who'd abandoned their posts as Army scouts to join the resistance. Their defection represented an intelligence catastrophe for General Whitfield, since Crow scouts had provided the military with detailed knowledge of Native American tactics and intentions for over a decade. More importantly, it demonstrated that the unity the government thought it had achieved through divide-and-conquer policies was more fragile than anyone had realized. Samuel found himself assigned the role of liaison between the various factions, partly because his ranch provided neutral ground and partly because none of the war chiefs wanted to appear subservient to leaders from other tribes. It was a delicate diplomatic dance, requiring him to navigate centuries of intertribal politics while helping coordinate preparations for a battle that would require unprecedented cooperation. The defensive strategy that emerged from their war councils was more sophisticated than Samuel had expected. Rather than simply fortifying a single position and waiting for the army to attack, the plan called for a series of layered defensive positions designed to channel Whitfield's forces into carefully prepared killing zones while preserving escape routes for non-combatants if the battle turned against them. The creek bottom would serve as the main camp and supply depot, protected by rifle pits dug into the banks and connected by covered trenches that would allow defenders to move without exposing themselves to artillery fire. The hills behind the ranch house provided elevated positions for sharpshooters armed with long-range rifles, while the rocky outcroppings near the creek offered natural fortifications that could anchor the defensive line even if other positions were overrun. But the most crucial element was psychological rather than tactical. The warriors needed to believe they could win against overwhelming odds, and their leaders needed to convince them that dying here would accomplish something more meaningful than simply prolonging their suffering on reservations designed to destroy their culture slowly rather than quickly. Samuel watched this transformation of his property with feelings he couldn't quite name. Part of him mourned the loss of the peaceful life he'd planned with Rebecca Morrison, the quiet domesticity that now seemed as distant as childhood memories. But another part of him felt energized by being involved in something larger than his own concerns, by contributing to a cause that would be remembered long after everyone currently living was dead. The work proceeded with extraordinary efficiency, despite the language barriers and cultural differences between the various groups. Warriors who couldn't speak each other's languages communicated through hand signs, shared tasks that required no words, and demonstrated the kind of practical cooperation that emerges when survival depends on setting aside old grudges in favor of immediate necessity. Samuel's house became the unofficial headquarters for planning sessions that sometimes lasted deep into the night. Maps drawn on deer hide showed every trail, water source, and defensive position within 20 miles of the ranch. Scouts reported hourly on General Whitfield's progress as his column moved north from Fort Abraham Lincoln, their advance slowed by the artillery pieces and supply wagons necessary for a sustained campaign, but inexorably approaching the confrontation everyone knew was coming. The Army's movement patterns revealed Whitfield's tactical thinking with uncomfortable clarity. He was advancing in a compact formation, designed to prevent the kind of hit-and-run attacks that had proven effective against dispersed cavalry patrols, but which would be vulnerable to concentrated fire from prepared positions if he could be forced to attack uphill against fortified defenders. Whitfield clearly expected to find the warriors scattered across difficult terrain, requiring him to hunt them down in small groups over weeks or months. The intelligence provided by Crow Scouts had emphasized Native American mobility as their primary tactical advantage, leading the general to prepare for a campaign of pursuit rather than a conventional battle. Discovering that his enemies had chosen to make a stand in a fixed position would force him to adapt his strategy, potentially creating opportunities for defenders who understood the terrain better than he did. On the morning of the second day, Samuel rode out with a mixed patrol of scouts to observe the Army's approach from a ridge 10 miles east of the ranch. What he saw through Thunder Horse's field glasses, captured from a cavalry officer during a skirmish the previous year, made his stomach clench with apprehension. Whitfield's column stretched for nearly 2 miles along the trail, a professional military force moving with the kind of disciplined precision that had conquered an entire continent. 8 companies of cavalry rode in formation, flanked by infantry units marching in perfect step, despite the rough terrain. Artillery pieces rolled between the mounted and foot soldiers, their bronze barrels gleaming in the morning sun like instruments of divine judgment, but it was the support elements that truly demonstrated the Army's commitment to total victory. Supply wagons carried enough ammunition and provisions for a month-long campaign. Ambulances staffed with military surgeons suggested Whitfield expected significant casualties, but was prepared to sustain them. Most ominously, a detachment of engineers accompanied the main force, bringing equipment for bridging rivers, clearing obstacles, and reducing fortifications that couldn't be taken by direct assault. "He means to finish this," Thunder Horse observed quietly, lowering the field glasses after studying the approaching army. "No half measures, no negotiations. Complete destruction or complete surrender." Samuel nodded, understanding now why the various war chiefs had been willing to set aside tribal differences in favor of cooperation. This wasn't a local conflict that could be resolved through traditional warfare or diplomatic negotiation. Whitfield represented the full power of the United States government, backed by industrial resources and military technology that made resistance seem futile. Yet as they rode back toward the ranch, Samuel found himself thinking about other desperate stands that had seemed hopeless at the time. The Alamo defenders who'd held off Santa Anna's army for 13 days. The Confederate soldiers who'd charged Union positions at Gettysburg knowing they couldn't win. The settlers who defended remote outposts against overwhelming odds simply because retreat meant abandoning everything they'd worked to build. Sometimes the act of resistance mattered more than the outcome of the battle. Sometimes standing up against injustice served purposes that couldn't be measured in military victories or territorial gains. The warriors gathering at his ranch understood this in ways that professional soldiers trained to fight for abstract concepts like national honor might never comprehend. That evening brought news that changed everything. A lone rider approached the camp flying a white flag, identifying himself as Lieutenant Morrison from General Whitfield's staff. The name struck. Samuel like lightning Morrison, the same surname as the woman who should have been his bride. The coincidence seemed too strange to be accidental, and he found himself wondering if Rebecca Morrison had family in the military, if her delayed arrival was connected somehow to the approaching confrontation. Lieutenant Morrison was a young man, probably no older than 25, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he'd joined the army because he believed in protecting civilization from savage raiders rather than for personal glory or advancement. He rode into the camp with obvious nervousness, his eyes taking in the scale of the defensive preparations with growing alarm. Crying Wolf met the officer under a truce flag, accompanied by the other war chiefs and Samuel as their designated spokesman for dealing with white officials. The lieutenant's message was exactly what they'd expected, a formal demand for immediate surrender, followed by relocation to designated reservations under military escort. General Whitfield wishes me to inform you that resistance is futile, Morrison said, his voice carrying better than his apparent confidence. You are outnumbered 2-1 by professional soldiers equipped with modern weapons and artillery. Surrender now, and the general promises fair treatment according to established military protocol. Iron Hawk responded in Arapaho, his words translated by one of the Crow Scouts who spoke multiple languages. He says to tell the general that we have heard such promises before, and we have seen what they are worth. The reservation at Pine Ridge was supposed to provide enough food and supplies for our people, but children starve there while government contractors grow rich selling goods intended for native families to white merchants in nearby towns. Lieutenant Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly not prepared for specific accusations of corruption and mismanagement. The general also authorizes me to guarantee safe passage for all women and children who wish to leave before hostilities commence. They will be escorted to the nearest Indian agency and provided with appropriate care. Small Bear's response required no translation, delivered in English learned during his years trading with white settlements. You ask us to send our families to the same places where other women watch their children die of diseases that do not exist in our traditional camps, where young men kill themselves rather than live as prisoners, where everything that makes us who we are is slowly strangled by people who believe they are saving us from ourselves. The lieutenant's face showed genuine confusion, as if he'd never considered that Native Americans might have rational reasons for resisting government benevolence. Samuel realized that Morrison probably represented the thinking of many ordinary soldiers' men who genuinely believed they were protecting civilization from unprovoked savage attacks, who'd been told that military action was necessary because negotiations had failed due to Native American irrationality rather than government bad faith. What am I supposed to tell the general? Morrison asked finally. What terms would you accept for peaceful resolution? Crying Wolf spoke for the first time, his words carrying the formal cadence of a diplomatic pronouncement. Tell General Whitfield that we ask only what any people would ask, the right to live as our ancestors lived, on lands our families have occupied for more generations than his government has existed, according to the customs and beliefs that connect us to the spirits of our fathers and the hopes of our children. You're asking for something the government cannot grant, Morrison replied. The territory has been legally ceded to the United States. Treaties have been signed. Laws have been passed. The general has no authority to reverse decisions made in Washington. Then the general has his answer, Thunderhorse said simply. We will not surrender what cannot be legally taken from us, and we will not abandon our families to a system designed to destroy them slowly rather than quickly. Lieutenant Morrison sat in silence for several moments, clearly struggling with the gap between his expectations and the reality he'd encountered. Finally, he nodded stiffly and began to turn his horse away, then paused as if remembering something important. "There is one more thing," he said, addressing Samuel directly. "The General knows you are here. Mr. Hartwell, he wants you to understand that any American citizen found in arms against the United States, military, will be tried for treason and hanged if convicted. You still have time to distance yourself from this action." Samuel met the young officer's eyes steadily. "Tell the General that I understand the consequences of my choices. Tell him also that I've seen enough of how his government treats people who trust its promises to know which side belong on." Morrison nodded once more and rode away, his white flag snapping in the evening breeze as he disappeared into the gathering darkness. Behind him, the camp continued its preparations with renewed urgency, everyone understanding that the time for talking had ended, and the time for fighting was almost upon them. Samuel stood with the war chiefs watching the lieutenant's retreat, knowing that within hours General Whitfield would begin his final advance toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the warriors gathered at his ranch, but the future of Native American resistance to government policies designed to eliminate them as distinct peoples. The gathering storm was about to break, and nothing any of them did from this point forward would change the fact that by the next sunset, many of the people now making final preparations for battle would be dead. The only question remaining was whether their deaths would serve some purpose greater than satisfying the government's need to demonstrate that resistance was futile. Tomorrow would bring the test of everything they'd planned, everything they'd sacrificed, everything they've hoped to accomplish by choosing to stand together against impossible odds. Samuel Hartwell, who'd wanted nothing more than a quiet life with a mail-order bride, was about to become part of history in ways he could never have imagined. Dawn came reluctantly on the third day, as if the sun itself hesitated to illuminate what was about to unfold across the Montana prairie. The air hung thick with morning mist that clung to the creek bottom like smoke from ghostly fires, muffling sounds and shrouding the defensive positions in gray veils that would provide precious cover for the coming battle. Samuel had not slept at all during the night, spending the dark hours making final rounds of the fortifications with Crying Wolf, checking ammunition supplies, and saying quiet goodbyes to warriors who might not survive to see another sunset. Transformation of his ranch into a fortress had been completed with remarkable efficiency. Rifle pits connected by covered trenches snaked along both banks of the creek, their positions carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire that would turn any frontal assault into a slaughter. The hills behind the main camp bristled with concealed sniper positions where the most skilled marksmen waited with captured military rifles and carefully hoarded ammunition. Even the ranch house itself had been converted into a strongpoint, its thick log walls reinforced with earthworks and firing ports cut through the windows. Samuel knew that all their preparations might prove insufficient against the professional army now approaching through the morning fog. General Whitfield commanded not just superior numbers, but also artillery pieces that could reduce their fortifications to rubble and Gatling guns capable of sweeping entire sections of the defensive line clear of defenders. The warriors' only advantages were intimate knowledge of the terrain, the desperation of men fighting for their family's survival, and the element of surprise that came from making a stand where the enemy expected them to run. Thunderhorse appeared at Samuel's elbow like a shadow materializing from the mist, his painted face grim with the knowledge that this day would likely be his last. The young war leader had spent the night moving among his warriors, speaking words of encouragement and sharing final instructions for the battle to come. Now he carried himself with the ceremonial dignity of a man who had made his peace with death and found it acceptable. "The scouts report Whitfield's column is 3 miles out," Thunderhorse said quietly. "They will be in position to attack within the hour." Samuel nodded, feeling his stomach tighten with anticipation that was equal parts fear and determination. 3 miles meant they could already hear the distant rumble of artillery wheels and supply wagons if they listened carefully. Could perhaps catch glimpses of dust clouds marking the army's approach through breaks in the morning mist. "Are your men ready?" Samuel asked. Thunder Horse smiled grimly. "My warriors have been ready since the day they were born. Today they will prove that some spirits cannot be broken by threats or bribes or promises of easier lives in captivity." Across the creek, Iron Hawk was conducting final preparations with his Arapaho fighters, their positions carefully integrated with those of Small Bear's Cheyenne to ensure that the loss of any single position wouldn't compromise the entire defensive line. The cooperation between traditionally rival tribes remained one of the most remarkable aspects of the gathering centuries of warfare and competition, set aside in favor of unity against a common enemy that threatened them all equally, the Crow. Defectors led by Running Elk had been assigned the most dangerous task, serving as forward observers, who would provide early warning of the Army's movements while remaining close enough to the main defensive positions to withdraw quickly when the shooting started. Their intimate knowledge of military tactics, gained through years of service as government scouts, made them invaluable for anticipating Whitfield's strategy and identifying weaknesses in his deployment. Samuel made his final rounds of the defensive positions, stopping to shake hands with men he'd come to respect over the past 3 days, despite the language barriers that prevented detailed conversation. These warriors represented the last generation of Native Americans who remembered life before the reservations, who had learned to hunt and fight and live according to traditions stretching back countless generations. Their children would grow up in a world where such knowledge was considered dangerous and primitive, where assimilation into white society would be enforced through systematic destruction of everything that connected them to their ancestors. At the main rifle pit overlooking the creek crossing, Samuel found Crying Wolf making final adjustments to a captured Springfield rifle that had probably belonged to a cavalry trooper who would never need it again. The chief's calm demeanor provided a steadying influence on the younger warriors, but Samuel could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes, the knowledge that his decisions had brought together the largest gathering of hostile tribes in decades, and that the consequences of those decisions would be measured in the lives of men who trusted his judgment. "Do you think we can win?" Samuel asked quietly. Crying Wolf considered the question seriously before answering. "Victory has many meanings. If you mean can we defeat Whitfield's army and drive the government from our lands permanently, then no, we cannot win. But if you mean can we die in a way that will be remembered, can we make the cost of conquest so high that other tribes will be inspired to resist? Can we prove that our people possess courage worthy of the ancestors who came before us? Then, yes, we have already won." The philosophy behind those words struck Samuel with unexpected force. He'd been thinking in terms of conventional military victory, measuring success by body counts and territorial control, but Crying Wolf was operating according to a different calculus entirely. For the chief, the battle's outcome mattered less than the act of resistance itself, the demonstration that some things were worth dying for, even when survival was impossible. Rifle shot cracked across the morning air, the signal from forward. Scouts that Whitfield's army had been sighted approaching the outer defensive perimeter. Samuel felt his pulse quicken as warriors throughout the camp responded to the alert, taking up positions they'd rehearsed during the previous days, checking weapons and ammunition supplies one final time before the killing began. Through his field glasses, Samuel could see the approaching column deploying from march formation into battle, array with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine. Infantry companies spread out in extended lines designed to minimize casualties from concentrated fire while maximizing their own firepower. Cavalry units moved to protect the flanks and provide mobility for exploiting any breakthrough in the defensive positions. Artillery pieces unlimbered on elevated ground that would give them clear fields of fire into the creek bottom where most of the warriors waited. General Whitfield had chosen his deployment carefully, demonstrating the kind of tactical competence that had made him successful during the Civil War. His plan was methodical rather than brilliant. Use superior firepower to suppress the defenders, then advance in overwhelming strength to complete their destruction through close combat, where military discipline and training would provide decisive advantages. But the general's plan depended on assumptions that might not prove accurate. He expected to face warriors fighting in traditional Plains Indian-style mounted charges, hit-and-run tactics, individual heroics rather than coordinated defense. The fortified positions and disciplined fire plan that awaited his attack represented a departure from established patterns that might disrupt his careful calculations. The first artillery shells began falling at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, their explosions sending geysers of earth and creek water skyward, while shrapnel whistled overhead with the sound of deadly rain. Samuel pressed himself against the walls of a rifle pit as the bombardment intensified, feeling the ground shake with each impact while dirt and debris rained down on the defenders, crouched in their fighting positions. The psychological effect of artillery fire was almost as devastating as its physical impact. Warriors who had faced cavalry charges and rifle volleys without flinching found themselves tested by weapons that were killed at distances too great for retaliation, that struck without warning from directions impossible to predict. Some of the younger fighters showed signs of panic during the first few minutes of shelling, but the steadying influence of veteran war leaders kept the defensive line intact, despite the terror raining from the sky. Samuel discovered that waiting under artillery fire was worse than any fear he'd previously experienced. During his worst nightmares about Indian raids or cattle rustlers, he'd always imagined himself fighting back, using his rifle and his knowledge of the terrain to defend what belonged to him. But artillery rendered such responses meaningless. There was nothing to shoot at, nowhere to hide, nothing to do except endure and hope that the next shell would fall somewhere else. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, the artillery barrage lifted and shifted to targets deeper in the defensive zone. Immediately, bugle calls echoed across the battlefield as Whitfield's infantry began their advance, moving forward in neat lines that reminded Samuel of illustrations he'd seen of Civil War battles. The soldiers advanced steadily despite rifle fire from the concealed defenders, their discipline holding firm even as men began falling to accurate shooting from warriors who'd been hunting with firearms since childhood. The first real test came when the lead elements of the advancing infantry reached the creek crossing where the defenders had concentrated their strongest positions. Rifle fire erupted from both banks with devastating effect, cutting down soldiers who'd expected to face disorganized resistance rather than carefully planned defensive fire. The attack stalled as officers tried to reorganize their formations while maintaining forward momentum against opposition that proved far more dangerous than anticipated. Samuel found himself firing alongside Thunder Horse and several Lakota warriors, whose names he'd never learned, but whose courage he'd come to admire during the long night of preparation. His Winchester rifle bucked against his shoulder as he aimed at blue uniformed figures advancing through the smoke and confusion of battle, each shot representing a conscious choice to kill men who were simply following orders they believed would protect innocent civilians from savage raiders. The moral complexity of his situation struck him even in the heat of combat. He was shooting at American soldiers, men who might have grown up on farms like his own, who joined the army seeking adventure or steady pay or a chance to serve their country. But those same soldiers were participating in a campaign designed to complete the destruction of entire peoples, to finish what disease and starvation and broken treaties had begun. The infantry attack broke against the creek crossing defenses. like waves against a rocky shore, leaving dozens of blue-clad bodies floating in water that ran red with blood from both sides. But Samuel could see that the defenders' ammunition was running low, that several positions had been silenced by accurate return fire from soldiers who were learning to identify the source of resistance, despite the concealment provided by fortifications. And morning mist dot as if reading his thoughts. Crying Wolf appeared at his shoulder carrying a captured cavalry carbine and a grim expression that spoke of casualties mounting faster than had been anticipated. "We cannot hold the creek line much longer," the chief said quietly. "Too many good men dead, not enough ammunition remaining." Samuel looked out over the battlefield and saw that the defensive plan was working exactly as intended, and that its success might not be enough. The warriors had inflicted heavy casualties on Whitfield's forces, while suffering relatively few losses themselves, but they were trading ammunition for time at a rate that couldn't be sustained much longer. Soon they would face the choice between withdrawing to secondary positions in the hills or making a final stand with empty rifles against an enemy that still outnumbered them significantly. The decision was made for them when cavalry units that had been waiting in reserve suddenly appeared on both flanks, moving at the gallop to envelope the creek bottom positions before the defenders could withdraw. It was a classic military maneuver, executed with the kind of professional competence that reminded Samuel why the U.S. Army had conquered a continent, despite facing enemies who knew the terrain better and had stronger motivation to fight. "Fall back," Thunderhorse shouted in English, then repeated the command in Lakota for warriors who might not understand. "Secondary positions, fighting withdrawal." The retreat from the creek line positions became a desperate race against time as warriors tried to reach the prepared fallback positions in the hills before cavalry units could cut off their escape routes. Samuel found himself helping carry wounded men who couldn't walk on their own, struggling up steep slopes while rifle fire crackled around them and the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder behind them. The ranch house that had been Samuel's home for 7 years erupted in flames as artillery shells found their mark, sending pillars of smoke skyward that would be visible for miles in every direction. Everything he'd worked to build was being destroyed in a single morning, reduced to ashes and memories by forces he'd chosen to oppose despite knowing the likely consequences. But as he reached the hilltop positions and looked back over the battlefield, Samuel realized that something remarkable had happened during the first phase of the battle. Whitfield's army had won the tactical engagement. They'd captured the creek bottom and forced the defenders to withdraw, but they'd paid a price in casualties that would be remembered long after the names of the dead soldiers were carved on memorial stones in distant cemeteries. More importantly, the warriors had proved they could fight as an organized military force rather than simply as individual heroes seeking personal glory. They demonstrated tactical discipline and strategic coordination that challenged every assumption about Native American military capabilities. Word of this battle would spread to reservations throughout the West, carrying the message that resistance was still possible for those brave enough to attempt it. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, fought among rocks and pine trees where cavalry charges would be impossible and artillery less effective. Here, if anywhere, the warriors might find the kind of terrain that would allow their superior knowledge of the country and their desperation to make a difference against professional soldiers armed with modern weapons. Samuel checked his remaining ammunition, fewer than 20 cartridges for his Winchester, plus the revolver he'd carried but not yet used. Around him, warriors were making similar calculations, preparing for what they all knew would be the last act of a drama that had been building toward this moment for generations. The hour of fire had come, and whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether the last free Native Americans on the northern plains would die as prisoners, or as warriors worthy of the ancestors who had given them life, the rocky outcropping that served As the warrior's final defensive position jutted from the hillside like the backbone of some ancient beast, its granite surfaces scarred by centuries of wind and weather, into natural fortifications that no engineer could have improved upon. Samuel pressed himself against the cold stone as rifle bullets whined overhead, their impact sending sparks and stone chips flying in deadly showers that forced the defenders to keep their heads down while General Whitfield's forces consolidated. Their control of the creek bottom below from his position among the rocks, Samuel could see the full scope of the disaster that had befallen his ranch. The house where he'd planned to raise children with Rebecca Morrison was now a blackened skeleton of charred timbers, smoke still rising from its ruins like incense offered to whatever gods presided over the destruction of dreams. His barn had collapsed under artillery fire, taking with it the winter hay that would have fed his cattle through the harsh Montana cold. Even the fence he'd repaired with such care just days earlier lay twisted and broken, its rails scattered across pastures now churned to mud by the hooves of cavalry horses and the boots of advancing infantry. But the physical destruction of his property seemed almost insignificant compared to the human cost already paid during the morning's fighting. Samuel had watched young warriors die with their names unspoken, their bodies left behind during the retreat because carrying them would have meant abandoning living men who still had chances of survival. Mothers would never know what happened to sons who'd ridden away to join the resistance. Children would grow up without fathers who'd chosen death over dishonor. Thunder horse crouched behind a boulder 20 feet away, his war paint streaked with sweat and gunpowder residue, methodically checking the action of a Spencer carbine he'd taken from a dead cavalry trooper during the retreat from the creek positions. The young war leader had been wounded during the withdrawal, a bullet grazed across his left shoulder that he'd bound with strips torn from his shirt, but he continued directing his warriors with the calm competence of a professional soldier who understood that panic would kill them faster than enemy bullets. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Samuel called across the space between their positions. During a lull in the rifle fire from below, Thunder Horse's answer was grimmer than Samuel had expected. "Perhaps 50 rounds for all my warriors combined. Iron Hawks Arapaho are in similar condition. Small Bear Cheyenne still have some cartridges, but not many." 50 rounds divided among 60 warriors meant less than 1 cartridge per man, enough for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained fighting if they were careful, or 1 final volley if they chose to make their last stand dramatic rather than prolonged. Samuel checked his own ammunition and found 12 cartridges for his Winchester plus 6 rounds in the revolver he'd carried, but not yet fired. 18 shots to account for a lifetime of choices that had led him to this rocky hillside, where he would probably die alongside men whose languages he couldn't speak but whose courage he'd learned to admire. The temporary quiet that had settled over the battlefield was broken by the sound of a bugle call echoing up from the valley floor, not the attack signal Samuel had been expecting, but something else entirely. Through the field glasses Thunder Horse had captured along with the Spencer carbine, Samuel could see white flags appearing among the blue uniformed figures moving in the creek bottom, and a small group of officers riding slowly up the slope toward the rocky defensive positions. "Parley," Crying Wolf said, materializing from behind a cluster of boulders where he'd been coordinating the distribution of remaining ammunition among the various tribal groups. "General Whitfield wants to talk." The irony wasn't lost on Samuel after spending the morning trying to kill each other with professional efficiency. Both sides were now prepared to observe the civilized conventions of warfare that governed negotiations between enemies who respected each other's courage, if not their causes. It was a peculiarly American tradition, this willingness to suspend hostilities temporarily while leaders discussed terms that everyone knew would be unacceptable to at least one side. The delegation that climbed toward their positions was led by General Whitfield himself, a man in his late 50s whose gray beard and weathered features spoke of decades spent in military service on various frontiers, where the expansion of American civilization required the displacement of peoples who'd been living there since time immemorial. He rode with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command, but Samuel noticed that his eyes constantly scanned the rocky terrain around them, cataloging defensive positions and escape routes with the instinctive wariness of a soldier who'd survived too many battles to take unnecessary risks. Beside Whitfield rode a younger officer Samuel recognized as Lieutenant Morrison, the same man who delivered the surrender ultimatum the previous evening. But now Morrison's earnest face showed the strain of someone who'd spent the morning watching men die for causes that seemed less clear-cut than they had in the abstract discussions of military strategy. War had a way of complicating simple moral equations, of forcing good men to participate in actions they might have condemned in peacetime. The third member of the delegation was Pivot, unexpected, a civilian dressed in the black suit and white collar of a minister, but carrying himself with the kind of authority that suggested he represented interests beyond purely spiritual concerns. Samuel suspected this was one of the Indian agents responsible for implementing government policy regarding Native American affairs, men who genuinely believed they were saving savage peoples from themselves, while simultaneously ensuring that valuable land and resources passed into the hands of those capable of developing them properly. Crying Wolf walked out to meet the delegation at a point roughly halfway between the opposing forces, his dignity intact despite the morning's losses and the hopelessness of his tactical situation. The other war chiefs followed at respectful distance, Iron Hawk moving with the careful grace of a man nursing wounds that would have sent a lesser fighter to the ground, Small Bear carrying himself with the ceremonial formality appropriate to what might be the last official act of his people's independence. Samuel found himself included in the group, partly because his ranch had served as the gathering point for the resistance, and partly because the white officials seemed more comfortable discussing terms with someone who shared their cultural background, even if he'd chosen to oppose their government's policies. It was a role he'd neither sought nor wanted, but circumstances had made him a bridge between worlds that were about to collide with devastating finality. General Whitfield dismounted and approached the assembled war chiefs with the kind of professional respect that soldiers often showed for enemies who'd fought with skill and courage. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "you fought well this morning. Your tactical dispositions were excellent, and your warriors showed discipline under fire that would credit any military organization." The compliment was genuine, Samuel realized, not merely diplomatic courtesy. Whitfield had expected to face disorganized resistance that could be quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Instead, he'd encountered a coordinated defense that had cost him perhaps 100 casualties, while inflicting losses the defenders could ill afford, but had accepted with stoic determination. "However," the general continued, "your situation is now untenable. You're surrounded, outnumbered, and virtually out of ammunition. Further resistance will accomplish nothing except additional bloodshed that serves no useful purpose for either side." Crying Wolf listened to this assessment without visible emotion, then replied in the measured tones of a diplomat rather than a defeated enemy. "General Whitfield, we appreciate your acknowledgement of our warriors' courage, but we cannot agree that further resistance serves no purpose. Our purpose was never military victory in the conventional sense. It was to demonstrate that some principles are worth dying for, that our people possess honor worthy of the ancestors who gave us life." The philosophical difference underlying their conflict emerged clearly in this exchange. Whitfield operated according to military logic that measured success in terms of objectives achieved and casualties minimized. Crying Wolf was fighting for intangible values that couldn't be quantified in conventional terms, but which gave meaning to the struggle regardless of its outcome. Lieutenant Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly struggling with aspects of the situation that hadn't been covered in his military education. Surely there must be some accommodation that would preserve honor on both sides while preventing further loss of life, he said. The government's policy isn't intended to destroy your people, but to provide them with opportunities for peaceful development under American protection. Iron Hawk's response carried the bitter edge of experience with government promises. Lieutenant, we have seen the results of such protection on the reservations where our relatives now live. The children forget the languages of their grandmothers. The young men have nothing to hunt, nowhere to prove their courage except in fights among themselves over rations that are never adequate. The women watch their families slowly die of diseases that didn't exist when we lived according to the old ways. The civilian in the ministerial collar spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to explaining complex policy to people, presumed incapable of understanding its broader implications. The reservation system represents the only practical method for preserving Native American peoples, while allowing for the orderly development of territorial resources. Left to pursue traditional lifestyles, your tribes would inevitably come into conflict with settlers whose rights must also be protected. Small Bear's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Protected from what? From people who were living on this land before your ancestors crossed the Great Water. From families who took only what they needed and left the rest for their children's children. You speak of orderly development as if turning grassland into profit was ordained by the spirits that created this world. Samuel found himself thinking about Rebecca Morrison during this exchange, wondering what she would have made of the philosophical arguments being presented with such deadly seriousness. Would she have understood why he'd chosen to risk everything for abstract principles of justice? Would she have shared his conviction that some fights were worth having even when victory was impossible? But Rebecca Morrison belonged to a life he'd abandoned when he chose to stand with the warriors now facing extinction rather than surrender. The quiet domestic happiness he'd planned with a mail order bride had been replaced by something larger and more dangerous. Participation in events that would be remembered long after the participants were dead and buried. General Whitfield consulted a pocket watch, then looked up at the rocky positions where the remaining warriors waited for orders that would determine whether they lived to see another sunset. I'm authorized to offer the following terms, he said formally. All women and children will be guaranteed safe passage to the nearest Indian agency, where they'll receive food, medical care, and protection. Warriors who surrender unconditionally will be treated as prisoners of war rather than criminals, and will eventually be relocated to appropriate reservations where they can rejoin their families. The offer was more generous than Samuel had expected, suggesting that someone in Washington understood the political risks of conducting what might appear to be a massacre of families who'd committed no crime beyond refusing to abandon their traditional way of life. But he also recognized the careful language that left crucial details unspecified. Which reservations would house the prisoners, what conditions they would face there, how long the families would be separated. And if we refuse these terms? Crying Volfast, Whitfield's expression hardened slightly. Then I'll be forced to complete the mission I was assigned. My orders are explicit resistance to lawful government authority must be ended definitively. I have artillery and sufficient ammunition to reduce your defensive positions to rubble. Continued fighting will result in the death of every warrior on this hillside. The threat was delivered without emotion, a simple statement of military reality rather than a sadistic ultimatum. Whitfield was offering the warriors a choice between certain death and uncertain survival, between dying as heroes and living as prisoners, between preserving their dignity through final resistance and preserving their lives through submission to a system designed to destroy everything that made them who they were. Thunderhorse spoke quietly to the other war chiefs in Lakota, his words carrying the rhythmic cadence of formal council deliberation. Samuel caught only fragments of the discussion, but the tone suggested they were weighing options that all involved significant sacrifice. Finally, Crying Wolf nodded and turned back to face the general. "We require time to consult with our warriors," the chief said. "This decision affects not just those present, but the wives and children who trusted us to choose wisely, the ancestors whose spirits watch over us, the generations yet unborn who will judge our actions." "You have 1 hour," Whitfield replied. "After that, I'll resume military operations regardless of your decision." The general and his delegation withdrew to a respectful distance while the war chiefs climbed back toward the rocky positions where their warriors waited. Samuel found himself walking beside Crying Wolf, both men moving slowly as if reluctant to reach the place where final decisions would be made. "What will you choose?" Samuel asked quietly. Crying Wolf was silent for several minutes, his eyes focused on the distant mountains where free tribes had once hunted buffalo herds that stretched beyond the horizon. "We will choose as our ancestors would have chosen," he said finally. "With honor, with courage, and with acceptance of whatever consequences the spirits have prepared for us." The war council that followed was unlike anything Samuel had witnessed. During his years on the frontier, warriors who'd spent the morning fighting for their lives now engaged in formal debate about principles that transcended immediate survival. Some argued for accepting Whitfield's terms, pointing out that living prisoners could eventually escape or be rescued, while dead heroes could accomplish nothing for the families they left behind. Others insisted that surrender would betray everyone who'd already died during the morning's fighting, that accepting captivity would validate the government's assumption that Native American resistance could always be overcome through sufficient application of force. But the discussion that would determine the fate of the last free Native Americans on the northern plains wasn't conducted in terms of military strategy or political calculation. Instead, it focused on questions of spiritual obligation, what the warriors owed to ancestors who died defending the same principles, what they owed to children who would inherit whatever world their fathers' choices created, what they owed to the spirits of the land itself that had sustained their peoples for countless generations. Samuel listened to these deliberations with a growing understanding of how fundamentally different cultures could reach completely opposite conclusions when analyzing identical situations. From a European-American perspective, Whitfield's terms represented reasonable accommodation that would preserve life while acknowledging political reality. From the Native American perspective, those same terms represented spiritual death disguised as practical compromise. Iron Hawk summarized the dilemma with crystalline clarity. "If we surrender, our bodies will live, but our spirits will die slowly on reservations designed to make us forget who we are. If we fight, our bodies will die quickly, but our spirits will live forever in the songs our children sing about this day." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Every warrior chose death over captivity, chose honor over survival, chose to make their final stand among rocks that would become their tombstones, rather than walk away from principles that gave their lives meaning. It was a decision that Samuel found both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because it guaranteed the destruction of remarkable men whose courage deserved better fate. Inspiring because it demonstrated the existence of values that couldn't be purchased with promises or destroyed with artillery. As the hour allocated by General Whitfield drew to a close, Samuel made his own final choice. He could still walk away, could identify himself as a civilian caught up in events beyond his control, could probably survive to rebuild his ranch and resume the quiet life he'd originally planned. But that path would require abandoning men who'd trusted him. Betraying principles he'd discovered were more important than personal survival. "I'm staying," he told Crying Wolf, as the war chiefs prepared to send their rejection of Whitfield's terms down the hill. The chief studied Samuel's face with the kind of attention he might have given to reading weather signs before an important hunt. "You understand that staying means dying?" There will be no mercy for white men found fighting beside us." "I understand," Samuel replied. "But I also understand that some things matter more than dying. You taught me that." Crying Wolf nodded slowly, then extended his hand in the gesture of partnership they'd shared when Samuel first agreed to provide sanctuary for the gathering resistance. "Then we will die as brothers, fighting for something worthy of the price we pay." The sun had reached its zenith when the war chief's messenger reached General Whitfield's position with their formal rejection of his surrender terms. Samuel watched through the field glasses as the general received the response without visible emotion, then began issuing orders that would bring the morning's temporary peace to a definitive end. Artillery pieces that had been silent during the negotiations now swung toward the rocky positions, where fewer than 200 warriors waited with ammunition for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained fighting. Infantry companies that had been resting and reorganizing after their costly assault on the creek positions began moving into attack formations, designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Samuel checked his weapons. One final time, 12 cartridges for his Winchester, 6 rounds in his revolver, and a knife he'd carried since his father gave it to him on his 16th birthday. 18 shots and a blade to account for 34 years of life, most of them spent in peaceful solitude, but ending in violence that would determine whether his death served any purpose, beyond satisfying his own sense of honor. Around him, warriors were making similar preparations, with the methodical calm of men who'd accepted their fate and found peace in that acceptance. They spoke quietly to each other in languages Samuel couldn't understand, but their tone carried the universal cadence of final farewells between friends who'd shared dangers and would soon share death. The first artillery shell exploded against the rocks above Samuel's position, sending granite fragments whistling through the air like deadly hail. The bombardment that followed was more intense than anything they'd experienced during the morning assault, designed not just to suppress defensive fire, but to physically destroy the positions where the warriors had chosen to make their final stand. Samuel pressed himself against the stone and tried to prepare mentally for whatever came next, knowing that within minutes he would either be dead or fighting for his life against overwhelming odds. But strangely, he felt no regret for the choices that had brought him to this place. He'd lived as a man should live, according to principles that mattered more than convenience, standing beside people who deserved better than the fate their government had prepared for them. The price of honor was about to be paid in full, and Samuel Hartwell was ready to meet that price with the same courage shown by the warriors who'd taught him what it meant to die for something larger than himself. The final artillery barrage began at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun hung directly overhead like a merciless eye witnessing the last moments of the Northern Plains' final resistance. The bombardment was different from the morning's measured suppressive fire. This was a storm of explosive destruction designed to obliterate the rocky positions where fewer than 200 warriors had chosen to make their stand against the entire might of the United States Army. Samuel hugged the granite outcropping as shells exploded around him with earth-shaking violence, each impact sending cascades of stone fragments and choking dust through the defensive positions. The noise was beyond anything he'd experienced during the morning's fighting, a continuous thunder that made thought impossible and reduced the world to pure sensation. The bite of stone chips against exposed skin, the acrid taste of gunpowder smoke, the trembling of solid rock beneath artillery. Impacts that seemed powerful enough to split mountains. Through the chaos, Samuel caught glimpses of warriors maintaining their positions with supernatural calm. Thunder Horse crouched behind a boulder that had been chipped and scarred by shrapnel, methodically checking his captured Spencer carbine while debris rained around him like deadly snow. Small Bear had found shelter in a natural depression among the rocks, his weathered face composed in what might have been prayer or meditation, as he waited for the bombardment to end and the final assault to begin. Crying Wolf appeared through the smoke and dust like a spirit, materializing from the battlefield itself. moving from position to position with messages and encouragement for warriors who couldn't hear his words above the artillery thunder but could see his presence as proof that leadership endured even in the face of annihilation. The chief's calm authority provided an anchor of stability in a world gone mad with explosive violence, reminding his men that they fought for purposes larger than individual survival. The bombardment lasted exactly 30 minutes, long enough to exhaust the defenders' nerves and ammunition reserves, but not so long as to give them time to adapt to conditions that would have driven ordinary men to madness or flight. When the last shell exploded and relative quiet returned to the hillside, Samuel's ears rang with phantom echoes of sounds too loud for human perception to process normally. In the sudden silence that followed, bugle calls echoed up from the valley floor with crystalline clarity, not the complex musical phrases used for parade ground ceremonies, but the harsh, urgent notes that ordered soldiers to advance against enemy positions they might not survive to capture. Samuel raised his head cautiously above the rock that had sheltered him and saw General Whitfield's final assault, beginning with the methodical precision of a military machine designed to convert human courage into territorial conquest. 3 companies of infantry advanced in extended lines across the slope below, their blue uniforms standing out against the brown grass like targets painted for the convenience of defenders who had ammunition to spare. But Samuel knew that ammunition was exactly what the warriors lacked most desperately. Perhaps 40 rounds remaining among all the survivors, barely enough for 2 volleys before they would be reduced to fighting with knives and tomahawks against soldiers armed with modern rifles and fixed bayonets. Behind the advancing infantry, cavalry units waited in reserve to exploit any breakthrough in the defensive line, while artillery crews stood ready to resume their bombardment if the assault stalled against unexpected resistance. It was a perfectly executed military operation designed by professionals who understood that overwhelming force applied systematically would achieve victory regardless of enemy courage or tactical skill. Thunderhorse raised his Spencer carbine and fired the first shot of the final engagement, a carefully aimed round that dropped a sergeant leading the center company, causing momentary confusion as soldiers looked for the source of resistance they'd been told was already broken by the artillery barrage. His shot triggered a ragged volley from the surviving warriors, each man making his ammunition count with the precision that came from knowing these might be the last bullets they would ever fire. The effect was devastating despite the small number of defenders. Soldiers who'd expected to find shattered rocks and scattered bodies instead faced disciplined fire from positions they couldn't locate precisely. The assault wavered as men sought cover among the boulders and sparse vegetation, their officers shouting orders that were lost in the renewed chaos of combat. Samuel fired his Winchester methodically, each shot aimed at a specific target rather than wasted in the wild shooting that characterized panic. His first bullet took down a young trooper who couldn't have been older than 20, whose face showed the kind of eager determination that suggested he'd joined the army seeking adventure rather than wealth or escape from civilian troubles. The sight of the soldier falling with Samuel's bullet in his chest created a moment of moral vertigo that almost paralyzed his trigger finger. This was someone's son, probably someone's sweetheart, certainly someone whose death would leave permanent scars on people who'd never heard of Montana territory or understood why their boy had to die on a hillside thousands of miles from home. But the moment passed as Samuel remembered why he was fighting and who would die if he didn't. The warriors around him had families, 2 wives and children who faced death, or worse if the resistance failed completely. Mothers and fathers who'd raised sons to be proud of their heritage rather than ashamed of it. Every soldier climbing toward their position represented a government policy designed to erase entire peoples from existence, not through dramatic massacre, but through systematic destruction of everything that connected them to their ancestors and their land. Iron Hawk appeared at Samuel's shoulder, his face streaked with blood from a shrapnel wound that had laid his scalp open without penetrating his skull. The Arapaho war chief carried a rifle he'd taken from a dead cavalry trooper during the mornings. Fighting, and his ammunition pouch bulged with cartridges stripped from bodies, the retreating warriors had passed during their withdrawal to the hilltop positions. "We cannot hold much longer," Iron Hawk said quietly, his words barely audible above the rifle fire crackling around them. "Too few bullets, too many soldiers." Samuel nodded, understanding that they were witnessing the final minutes of Native American military resistance on the northern plains. When the ammunition ran out, which would happen within minutes at the current rate of fire, the warriors would face the choice between surrender and death by bayonet and saber. Given their unanimous rejection of Whitfield's terms, Samuel knew which option they would choose. The infantry assault gained momentum as soldiers learned to use the terrain for cover while advancing steadily toward positions they could now identify through muzzle flashes and powder smoke. Professional military training began to tell as sergeants coordinated small unit movements that flanked defensive positions, forcing warriors to divide their attention between multiple threats while conserving ammunition that was becoming more precious with each passing minute. Samuel's Winchester clicked empty after his 12th shot, leaving him with 6 rounds in his revolver and the knife his father had given him 2 decades earlier. Around him, other warriors were reaching similar points of desperation. Lakota fighters drawing war clubs from their belts, Cheyenne veterans pulling knives that had been passed down through generations of conflict, Arapaho warriors preparing for the kind of close combat that would determine who lived to see sunset. A rifle bullet struck the rock inches from Samuel's head, sending stone chips flying with enough force to draw blood from his cheek. He rolled sideways and saw a soldier working his way between boulders, perhaps 30 feet away, close enough for Samuel to see the concentration on his face as he reloaded his Springfield rifle. Too close for rifle fire, too far for knife work, exactly the right distance for the revolver Samuel had carried but never used. The Colt bucked in his hand as he fired all 6 rounds in rapid succession, watching the soldier stumble backward with at least 2 hits center mass. It was close-range shooting against a stationary target, but Samuel felt no satisfaction in the kill-only grim recognition that he'd used his last ammunition and would face whatever came next with nothing but steel and determination. Thunder. Horse's war cry echoed across the hillside as the young Lakota leader launched himself from behind cover toward a group of soldiers who'd advanced to within bayonet range of his position. His Spencer carbine had long since fallen silent for lack of ammunition, but his war club crushed skulls with the same efficiency that firearms had shown at longer ranges. For perhaps 30 seconds, he carved a path of destruction through the confrérie, advancing infantry before a volley of rifle fire brought him down in a spray of blood that painted the rocks crimson. The death of Thunder Horse seemed to galvanize the remaining warriors into final action. Small Bear led his surviving Cheyenne fighters in a charge that carried them into the midst of the advancing soldiers, where knife work and tomahawk blows created the kind of savage melee that European military tactics were poorly designed to handle. Iron Hawk gathered his Arapaho warriors for a similar assault from the opposite flank, forcing the infantry companies to fight in multiple directions, simultaneously while maintaining their advance up increasingly treacherous terrain. Samuel found himself moving without conscious decision, his father's knife in his hand as he followed the Arapaho charge toward soldiers who were trying to establish firing positions among the rocks. The blade that had skinned deer and cut rope for 2 decades now sought human targets with deadly purpose, finding gaps in uniform cloth and leather equipment that protected against everything except close-range violence delivered with desperate intensity. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was unlike anything Samuel had imagined during his peaceful years as a rancher. Men grappled among stones slippery with blood, using rifle butts and bayonets in bare hands to kill enemies whose faces they could see clearly enough to remember in whatever afterlife awaited soldiers and warriors alike. It was combat reduced to its most primitive elements, strength against strength, will against will, the determination to live measured against willingness to die for causes larger than individual survival. Samuel's knife found its target in the ribs of a corporal who'd been trying to reload his rifle while backing away from Iron Hawk's war club. The soldier fell with Samuel's blade still buried in his chest, taking the weapon with him and leaving Samuel armed with nothing but his hands and whatever courage remained after a morning of violence that had transformed him from peaceful rancher to participant in the final chapter of a historical tragedy. But even as the warriors fought with supernatural ferocity, the mathematics of their situation remained unchanged. They were outnumbered by more than 3-to-1 by professional soldiers, whose discipline held firm despite casualties that would have broken less experienced units. More infantry companies were climbing the slope to reinforce the assault, while cavalry units moved to cut off any possible escape routes that might tempt survivors to abandon the fight. Crying, Wolf appeared through the smoke and chaos of close combat, his war paint streaked with blood that might have been his own or that of enemies he'd killed during the final assault. The chief still carried himself with the dignity that had characterized his leadership throughout the gathering and the battle, but Samuel could see mortal wounds in his chest and abdomen that would claim his life within minutes, regardless of the engagement's outcome. "It is finished," Crying Wolf said simply, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the noise of battle raging around them. "We have done what we came to do." Samuel looked around the hillside and saw what the chief meant. The rocky positions that had sheltered nearly 200 warriors an hour earlier now held perhaps 30 survivors, most of them wounded and all of them out of ammunition. The ground was littered with bodies wearing both blue uniforms and traditional Native American clothing, testifying to courage shown by men on both sides who'd fought and died for causes they believed in completely. But more than that, Samuel realized they'd accomplished something that would outlast the immediate tactical failure. Word of this battle would spread to every reservation in the West, carrying the message that resistance was still possible for those brave enough to attempt it. Children would grow up hearing stories about the warriors who'd chosen death over surrender, who'd made the government pay a price in blood for policies designed to destroy entire peoples through systematic oppression disguised as benevolent protection. General Whitfield appeared among the advancing soldiers, his uniform torn and stained from personal participation in combat that had cost his command more casualties than any engagement since the Civil War. The general's face showed professional respect for enemies who'd fought with skill and courage, but also the grim satisfaction of a mission accomplished despite difficulties no one had anticipated. "Surrender now," Whitfield called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Further resistance serves no purpose. Your warriors have fought honorably. Let them die honorably rather than be cut down like animals." Crying Wolf struggled to his feet, using his rifle as a crutch while blood soaked the front of his shirt from wounds that had punctured vital organs. "General," he said with the formal courtesy appropriate to final diplomatic exchanges, "we thank you for acknowledging our warriors' courage. But we cannot surrender what was never ours to give away. Our spirits belong to the ancestors who came before us and the children who will come after us. Take our bodies if you must, but know that you have not conquered what matters most." The chief's words carried across the battlefield with the clarity of a formal pronouncement, reaching not just Whitfield and his officers, but also the surviving warriors, who'd chosen to make their final stand among rocks that would become their monuments. Samuel felt privileged to witness this moment, the last free chief of the Northern Plains delivering a philosophical statement that would outlast all the government policies designed to justify his destruction. Whitfield nodded slowly, recognizing the dignity in Crying Wolf's refusal even while preparing to complete the mission that had brought 800 soldiers to this remote hillside. "Then it ends here," the general said simply. The final volley was delivered by professional soldiers, who understood they were participating in something larger than a routine military operation. Their rifle fire was precise and merciful, designed to kill quickly rather than wound and capture men who'd chosen death over surrender. Crying Wolf fell first, struck by multiple bullets that ended his life instantly, followed by the other war chiefs who'd led their peoples to this place of final resistance. Samuel felt the impact of at least 3 rifle bullets, their force spinning him around and dropping him among rocks that had sheltered him during the longest day of his life. The pain was surprisingly distant, as if his body belonged to someone else, and he was observing its destruction from a safe emotional distance. But even as his vision darkened and his strength flowed away with the blood soaking his shirt, Samuel felt no regret for the choices that had brought him to this moment. He'd lived as a man should live, according to principles that mattered more than convenience, standing beside people who deserved better than the fate their government had prepared for them. The quiet life he'd planned with Rebecca Morrison belonged to a different person entirely, someone who'd never learned that some causes were worth dying for regardless of their chances for success. As consciousness faded, Samuel's last sight was of the sun setting behind peaks where free tribes had once hunted buffalo herds that stretched beyond the horizon. The light was golden and peaceful, suggesting that whatever came after death might hold more mercy than the world he was leaving behind. The Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch, as historians would later call it, ended with the complete destruction of the last organized Native American resistance on the northern plains. General Whitfield's after-action report noted that government forces had suffered 63 killed and over 100 wounded, while eliminating approximately 200 hostiles, including all their leadership. The report praised the tactical skill displayed by enemy forces, while emphasizing that decisive action had permanently resolved the threat they represented to peaceful settlement of the territory. But the official military history couldn't capture the full significance of what had occurred on Samuel Hartwell's former ranch. Word of the battle spread through reservation communities like wildfire, carrying stories of warriors who died rather than surrender, who'd proven that courage and honor could survive even when victory was impossible. Young men who'd grown up accepting the inevitability of their people's subjugation began to question whether that fate was truly inescapable. 3 years later, Lieutenant Morrison, now Captain Morrison, would discover a letter among his personal effects while packing for transfer to a new posting. The letter was addressed to Rebecca Morrison, care of General Delivery, Denver, Colorado, and had been written by Samuel Hartwell during the long night before the final battle. Morrison had retrieved it from Samuel's body after the fighting ended, intending to forward it to its intended recipient, but had forgotten about it during the chaos of dealing with casualties and writing reports. The letter's contents would haunt Morrison for the rest of his military career. Miss Morrison, by the time you read this, I will be dead, and the life we planned together will exist only in the realm of what might have been. I want you to know that I do not regret the choices that led me to this place, even though they cost us the happiness we both deserved. I have learned that some things matter more than individual survival, that some causes are worth dying for even when victory is impossible. The warriors I have fought beside are not the savages described in newspaper accounts, but men of honor who chose to stand up for their families and their beliefs when surrender would have meant spiritual death, disguised as physical survival. Perhaps you will find another man to share your life, someone who will give you the peaceful domesticity I cannot provide. I hope he proves worthy of your trust, and that your children grow up in a world where the kind of choices I faced are no longer necessary. But if you remember me at all, remember that I died trying to be the kind of man my father raised me to be, someone who stood up when it mattered, who chose justice over convenience, who risked everything for principles that couldn't be purchased with gold or enforced with guns. Your intended husband, Samuel Hartwell. Rebecca Morrison never received the letter. She had died of typhoid fever in a Denver boarding house 2 weeks before the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch, waiting for word from a rancher she'd never met about a life they'd never shared. But Morrison kept the letter until his own death 40 years later, and his widow donated it to the Montana Historical Society along with his other papers. Today, visitors to the Broken Arrow Ranch battlefield can see monuments honoring both the soldiers and warriors who died there, along with a small marker noting that Samuel Hartwell, civilian, chose to stand with the Native Americans in their final resistance to government policies he considered unjust. School children read about the battle in history books that struggle to explain why good men on both sides found themselves killing each other over issues that seem remote and abstract to modern readers. But the real monument to Samuel Hartwell and the warriors who died with him isn't carved from stone or bronze. It's found in the ongoing struggle for justice and human dignity that continues in every generation, in the choices made by ordinary people who find themselves facing extraordinary circumstances that test everything they believe about right and wrong. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that can't be won in conventional terms. Battles fought not for territory or resources, but for principles that give meaning to human existence. The rancher who waited for his bride, but received warriors instead, learned that some causes are worth dying for, even when dying accomplishes nothing more than proving that the human spirit cannot be conquered by force alone. The last free warriors of the Northern Plains died on a hillside in Montana, but their courage lives on in the stories told by their descendants and in the hearts of anyone who chooses to stand up for justice when standing up requires risking everything they hold dear. That may be the most lasting victory of all, not the kind that appears in military histories, but the kind that changes how people think about what's possible when ordinary individuals decide that some principles matter more than life itself. In the end, Samuel Hartwell got exactly what he'd been looking for, though not in the form he'd expected. He'd wanted a partner to help him build something meaningful on the frontier. Instead, he found a cause worthy of the only life he had to give, and brothers who showed him what it meant to die with honor intact. The sun set on the Northern Plains' last resistance, but it also rose on a legacy that would inspire future generations to believe that courage and conscience could triumph over fear and convenience, that individuals willing to risk everything for justice could change the world in ways that armies and governments never could. The mail-order bride never arrived, but something far more important had taken her place: the knowledge that one man's choice to stand with the oppressed rather than the oppressor could echo through history long after the governments and policies that seemed so permanent had crumbled into dust. That may have been the greatest love story of all. Years later, when the Western territories had become states and the frontier had been officially declared closed, anthropologists and historians would study the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch as a turning point in Native American resistance. They would analyze tactical decisions and strategic failures, debate whether different choices might have changed the outcome, and argue about the larger forces that made such conflicts inevitable. But they would miss the most important aspect of what happened on that Montana hillside: the profound transformation of individuals who discovered that their deepest values could only be preserved through ultimate sacrifice. The surviving members of General Whitfield's command carried scars from the battle that went far deeper than physical wounds. Captain Morrison, haunted by the courage he'd witnessed among enemies he'd been taught to consider savage, would spend his remaining military career advocating for more humane treatment of Native American prisoners. Sergeant Davies, who'd lost 3 fingers to a Cheyenne war club during the final assault, would resign from the Army and become a teacher on the Pine Ridge Reservation, dedicating his life to preserving the languages and traditions his former profession had tried to destroy. Even General Whitfield himself was changed by the encounter. His final report to Washington included unprecedented recommendations for reforming the reservation system, acknowledging that policies designed to eliminate Native American culture through systematic oppression were creating the very resistance they claimed to prevent. The general's suggestions were quietly ignored by bureaucrats who found it easier to maintain existing policies than to admit their fundamental injustice. But his words became part of the historical record that would eventually contribute to more enlightened approaches to indigenous rights. The Crow warriors who'd abandoned their posts as army scouts to join the resistance became legends among their own people, proof that loyalty to one's heritage could overcome the practical advantages of collaboration with government authorities. Their example inspired similar defections during subsequent conflicts, contributing to the eventual collapse of the Army's strategy of using tribal divisions to maintain control over native populations. Samuel's Ranch, site of the bloodiest engagement in Montana Territory's history, was never rebuilt. The territorial government declared the land forfeited due to its owner's treason, but no settlers could be found willing to farm ground that had been consecrated by so much blood. Local ranchers reported that cattle refused to graze in the creek bottom where the warriors had made their camp, as if the animals could sense something in the soil that human beings couldn't perceive. Eventually, the property was acquired by a coalition of tribal governments and converted into a memorial park where descendants of both sides could honor their ancestors' courage while working to ensure that such tragic conflicts would never again be necessary. The monument erected there bears no names of individual heroes or villains, only the words, "Here lie warriors and soldiers who died believing they served justice. May their sacrifice inspire future generations to find justice without bloodshed." The ripple effects of Samuel Hartwell's decision to stand with the warriors extended far beyond the immediate participants in the battle. His story spread through frontier communities where other isolated ranchers and farmers faced similar moral choices about how to respond to government policies they considered unjust. Some chose conformity and survival. Others chose resistance and consequences. But all of them were forced to examine their deepest beliefs about right and wrong, about individual responsibility and collective action, about the price of principle in a world that often rewarded expedience over ethics. Rebecca Morrison's story, too, became part of the larger legend. Her death from typhoid fever while waiting for a new life that would never materialize served as a reminder that history's grand tragedies are built from countless individual disappointments and lost opportunities. The children she never bore, the family she never raised, the happiness she never experienced, all became part of the price paid for a conflict that swept up innocent lives along with those who chose to participate directly. The mail order bride never arrived. But something far more important had taken her place, the knowledge that one man's choice to stand with the oppressed rather than the oppressor could echo through history long after the governments and policies that seemed so permanent had crumbled into dust. In the end, Samuel Hartwell discovered that love takes many forms, and that sometimes the greatest love of all is the willingness to die for strangers whose cause becomes more important than personal survival. That may have been the most profound love story ever written in blood and sacrifice on the unforgiving soil of the American frontier. Decades after the battle, archaeologists excavating the site made discoveries that added new dimensions to the story. Buried beneath layers of accumulated soil, they found personal artifacts that revealed the human side of the conflict. Child's wooden toy carved by Thunder Horse during the long nights before the fighting began. Letters written by soldiers to sweethearts they would never see again. Medicine bundles containing herbs gathered by warriors who knew they were preparing for their final journey. Among the most poignant discoveries was Samuel's pocket watch, the one his father had given him on his 18th birthday, found near the rocks where he'd made his last stand. The watch had stopped at 4:17, marking the exact moment when time ended for the last free rancher of the northern plains. Inside the watch case, investigators found a photograph, not of Rebecca Morrison, as they'd expected, but of his parents, standing in front of the original ranch house, their faces showing the kind of quiet determination that had shaped their son's character. The watch became the centerpiece of a museum exhibition that toured the country, telling the story of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. School children would press their faces against the display case, trying to imagine what it felt like to choose between survival and principle, between safety and justice. The exhibition sparked countless classroom discussions about moral courage, about the price of standing up for unpopular beliefs, about the difference between legal authority and moral legitimacy. Native American communities throughout the West adopted the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch as a symbol of resistance that transcended tribal boundaries. Songs were composed in half a dozen languages, telling the story of warriors who'd set aside ancient rivalries to stand together against a common threat. Ceremonial dances recreated the final moments of the battle, passing down to new generations. The memory of courage that couldn't be conquered by superior firepower. The story also found its way into the folklore of white frontier communities, though often in forms that sanitized the moral complexity of Samuel's choice. Some versions portrayed him as a tragic figure led astray by misguided sympathy for savage enemies. Others transformed him into a heroic defender of the underdog, who'd sacrificed everything for abstract principles of justice. But the most accurate versions, preserved by families whose ancestors had known Samuel personally, remembered him as a man who discovered that some things mattered more than the comfortable life he'd planned. Modern historians, studying the battle through contemporary documents, found evidence that Samuel's decision had been more calculated than the heroic narrative suggested. His correspondence with the matrimonial agency revealed a man struggling with loneliness and uncertainty about his future, someone who'd been searching for meaning long before the warriors arrived at his ranch. The choice to stand with them represented not a sudden conversion to political activism, but the culmination of a spiritual journey that had been years in the making. The letters he'd written but never sent, discovered in a trunk that survived. The fire that destroyed his house showed a thoughtful individual wrestling with questions about justice, belonging, and the obligations of conscience. One draft, apparently written shortly after his father's death, contained the prophetic words, "A man's legacy isn't measured by the acres he owns or the cattle he raises, but by the courage he shows when his deepest beliefs are tested by circumstances beyond his control." Even the weather seemed to remember what had happened on that Montana hillside. Local ranchers reported that storms often gathered over the battlefield with unusual intensity, as if the sky itself was still processing the violence that had occurred there. Meteorologists dismissed such observations as folklore, but Native American elders nodded knowingly when told of lightning that struck the memorial monument with remarkable frequency, leaving scorch marks that resembled the pictographs their ancestors had painted on sacred rocks. The most enduring legacy of the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch wasn't found in military histories or government records, but in the changed hearts of people who heard the story and recognized something of themselves in the choices faced by its participants. Teachers who'd never questioned authority found themselves standing up to administrators who valued compliance over education. Soldiers serving in distant conflicts discovered reserves of moral courage they hadn't known they possessed. Ordinary citizens facing their own moments of moral crisis remembered a rancher who'd chosen principle over survival and found strength to do the same. The mail-order bride never arrived, but her absence had created space for something larger and more lasting than personal happiness, a story of transformation that would inspire strangers for generations. A testament to the power of individual conscience to change the world in ways that armies and governments never could. Samuel Hartwell had been waiting for love, and had found it in the most unexpected form imaginable. The love of justice that burns so brightly it can illuminate the darkness for all who have eyes to see. The ripple effects of that single choice to stand with warriors instead of turning them away continued to spread across time like stones thrown into still water. In 1923, 50 years after the battle, a young Lakota man named Joseph Crowfeather graduated from Harvard Law School, and returned to the Pine Ridge Reservation, carrying with him both a degree in jurisprudence and stories his grandmother had told him about the last warriors who died free. Those stories, particularly the account of a white rancher who'd chosen death over complicity, had shaped his understanding of what justice could mean when it transcended racial boundaries. Crow Feather would go on to argue landmark cases before the Supreme Court, establishing legal precedents that protected Native American religious practices and land rights. In his most famous brief, he quoted extensively from Thunder Horse's final words, as recorded by military witnesses, arguing that the Constitution's guarantee of religious freedom must apply to all Americans regardless of their ancestry. The justices, moved by the eloquence of a dead warrior speaking across 5 decades, ruled unanimously in favor of tribal sovereignty over sacred sites. In 1943, during the darkest days of World War II, Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien found himself pinned down by German machine gun fire in a bombed-out village somewhere in Italy. His unit had been cut off from support, ammunition was running low, and retreat seemed the only rational option. But O'Brien carried in his pocket a worn copy of Samuel Hartwell's letter to Rebecca Morrison, given to him by his grandfather who'd served under General Whitfield at the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch. Reading those words about choosing justice over convenience, about risking everything for principles that couldn't be purchased with gold or enforced with guns, O'Brien made the decision to lead a flanking attack that saved his surrounded platoon but cost him his life. His Medal of Honor citation mentioned his extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds, but his personal effects included a note explaining that he'd learned about courage from a rancher who'd died 70 years earlier for standing up to his own government. The story found its way into unexpected places as the decades passed. In 1965, a young civil rights worker named Sarah Washington was arrested for organizing voter registration drives in rural Mississippi. While sitting in a jail cell that reeked of fear and hatred, she remembered her great-uncle's stories about warriors who'd chosen death over surrender, about a white man who'd stood with them despite knowing the consequences. Those memories gave her strength to continue her work even after facing beatings, death threats, and the constant possibility of ending up like the 3 volunteers who'd been murdered just counties away. By the 1970s, the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch had become required reading in American history courses, though professors struggled to explain why students found the story so compelling. Unlike other frontier conflicts that seemed remote and irrelevant to modern concerns, this battle resonated with young people who were questioning authority, challenging unjust laws, and trying to understand their own obligations to stand up for what they believed was right. Environmental activists found inspiration in us for what they believed was right. Environmental activists, Samuel's willingness to sacrifice his property for his principles. Anti-war protesters saw parallels between his resistance to government policy and their own opposition to the Vietnam conflict. Civil rights workers recognized the same moral courage they were trying to summon in their confrontations with institutionalized racism. The story had become a touchstone for anyone struggling with the gap between legal authority and moral legitimacy. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern European nations were throwing off decades of communist oppression, underground resistance leaders discovered translated copies of the Battle of Broken Arrow Ranch, accounts circulating through networks of dissidents and freedom fighters. Václav Havel, the playwright who became Czechoslovakia's first democratic president, later wrote that the story of warriors and a rancher choosing death over submission had helped him understand that some defeats are more valuable than victories, because they preserve the soul of a people even when they cannot preserve their lives. The digital age brought new dimensions to the story's influence. Internet forums dedicated to discussing moral courage inevitably featured lengthy threads analyzing Samuel's decision and debating whether his choice was heroic or foolishly suicidal. Military veterans shared their own experiences of moments when they'd faced similar choices between following orders and following conscience. Teachers posted lesson plans that used the battle as a case study in ethical decision-making under extreme pressure. Social media amplified the story's reach exponentially. #BrokenArrowCourage became a hashtag used by activists around the world who were facing persecution for their beliefs. Protesters in Hong Kong carried signs featuring quotes from Crying Wolf's final speech to General Whitfield. Climate change. Activists referenced Samuel's willingness to sacrifice his ranch for his principles when explaining why they were willing to risk arrest for blocking pipeline construction. The most remarkable aspect of the story's enduring power was its ability to transcend political boundaries and speak to people across the ideological spectrum. Conservative militiamen found inspiration in Samuel's armed resistance to federal authority. Liberal progressives admired his solidarity with an oppressed minority. Religious believers saw parallels to martyrs who died for their faith. Secular humanists recognized the triumph of universal moral principles over tribal loyalties. By the time the battle's 150th anniversary arrived in 2023, the memorial site had become one of the most visited historical landmarks in Montana. Visitors came from every continent, leaving flowers, prayer ties, and personal notes at the monument, where warriors and a rancher had chosen principle over survival. The guest book filled with entries in dozens of languages, all expressing variations on the same theme: gratitude for an example of moral courage that continued to inspire people to make difficult choices in their own lives. The mail-order bride never arrived, but her absence had made possible something far more enduring than a single family's happiness, a legacy of courage that would outlast nations, governments, and all the policies that had seemed so important to the men who'd fought and died on that Montana hillside. Love, it turned out, had arrived after all, just not in the form anyone could have expected. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.